Welcome to the Scholarship for Teaching and Learning podcast from the University of York. I'm Phil Martin.
I'm Lucy Turner Voakes.
I'm Nick Glover.
Thanks, Nick, for joining us today. We're going to talk about EDI. So, Nick, do you want to just give us a bit of a brief bio of your background and how you're interested in this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'm new to the university relatively. So the last 6 or 7 months, I think. So I came from the Students' Union to work there previously as student voice manager. So I was always interested in, I suppose, the learning and teaching side of student engagement, and worked with course reps and on various student staff partnerships. Saw the job at the university and was just really interested in the inclusive element. I think thinking through the inequalities, I suppose, that still exist in higher education and thinking through ways of challenging those, addressing those through learning, teaching and assessment. And I focus on social sciences as well in my current role. So that's my kind of disciplinary background as well, I suppose. Did a degree in politics and sociology and then peace studies for a master's degree. So it's a kind of perfect fit, my enjoyment of learning and teaching, higher education, and kind of really thinking about how we address sites of exclusion, promoting inclusion within the social sciences as well.
It seems to have become a lot more prominent over the last few years. People are talking about equality, diversity, and I'll edit this bit out. People are talking about equality, diversity, and inclusion a lot more. Has there been a particular catalyst for this? I mean, what's brought this to the forefront now, and what's the scope of EDI generally?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's a difficult question because the scope of EDI and inclusive practice in education, in higher education in particular, is probably as broad as it gets. Really, I think everything is an opportunity in a way to promote inclusion. So it's quite difficult, I think, and this is probably a problem as well. We conceptually open it up too much to some extent, I think. I think it's being catalyzed by award gaps and a kind of deeper recognition of continuing inequalities. So particularly, at York and other institutions that are similar, award gaps for Black students. So really working through why Black students' educational outcomes, why the rate at which they get 2-1s and first is somehow different to white students when they come with the same educational backgrounds and the same A-level results. So I think those award gaps have really catalyzed it. I think the other thing is thinking through about kind of widening participation. So we're getting more diverse, I suppose, as a university, which is brilliant, but it's surfacing issues, inequalities, tensions, I suppose, in the way people teach, the way people think about the design of their curriculum, their teaching approaches and assessments. So I think that's another reason why I don't want to call it a sexy thing because it's always been important, but I think it's particularly apt at the minute in terms of those gaps and thinking through our kind of increasingly diverse cohorts within our courses.
That's interesting that you're sort of talking about award gap being a big sort of part of that discussion, because in a sense it's a more data-driven discussion or potentially it could be a more data-driven discussion. So I'd agree. I don't think it's a new sort of impetus within higher education to try and address those inequalities, but to do that in a way that's maybe structured on actual hard data and information, and what we do with that does feel new. Yeah. And I suppose that kind of links a bit to potentially to scholarship and how that might fit in with that. And I suppose to sort of sandwich and stitch those things together in a kind of slightly intentional way. How does scholarship inform your work in the team? And can you talk to us a little bit maybe about sort of relationships between scholarship and students as partners, or some of the projects that you're working on? Yeah,
of course, yeah. Personally, I'm quite embedded and immersed in scholarship quite a lot. And I think, the trajectory of my career, I've kind of, I suppose, focused on evidence-based academic type roles. And certainly when I'm thinking about, for example, a particular issue, assessment, for example, we're doing a lot of thinking about at the minute. We'll start with the literature on assessment. And I think that was a good question about data, because I don't want to give too much of a political critique about the direction of higher education, but I think within our neoliberal world at the minute, of which kind of universities are part of, we get we get kind of bogged down in the data to some extent. So I think recognizing that there are award gaps and inequalities through the data then becomes to some extent an instrumental process. We don't think enough, I don't think, as not we in this room, but institutionally and sector wide, about how we design learning and teaching, based on that thinking, that scholarship, that research around good teaching, learning and assessment. Because I think it's easy to get instrumental about it, I suppose. We've got an award gap. How can we close that award gap? That becomes a kind of an outcome in itself. It becomes kind of reified in that way, and we forget about design from the point of design, I suppose, to some extent.
That's interesting and nicely healthy on a kind of process, not product type approach, isn't it? About what people are actually doing. And
I was just going to jump in and say on one of those points, it was is it linked really? You're talking about award gaps, and you mentioned for Black students. So EDI in higher education, how divorceable is this from broader social issues? There seems to be a lot more awareness and things on the news about social justice issues, generally from Me Too back in 2016 to things in the wake of George Floyd. Is what's going on in EDI in terms of attainment gaps and things like that mirroring what's going on in these broader social issues?
Interesting. Yeah, I suppose there's a key point there, isn't there, about not separating to some extent higher education and like you said, what's happening in the wider world. I think sometimes and I'll go back to kind of scholarship and the design of learning, teaching, assessment, because that's what we're here for. We're thinking about education and teaching for students. We sometimes separate it. I think that's my personal view, and I think allowing students to talk about those social issues, for example, in teaching spaces and not almost pretending that they're not happening in a way, I think is a really interesting direction, because it creates a more honest atmosphere within a classroom, within a university as well. And to me, we should be working with students, talking with students about how higher education is reproducing, but also can challenge those inequalities that are happening in the wider world. And so I think it's a kind of call for not separating them and bringing the social, the kind of the political into the classroom a bit more. And that part of that is allowing students and staff to, I suppose, bring their lived experiences, their identities within, into classrooms, into how we form relationships, I suppose, and how we teach.
That very much makes sense. Can I be devil's advocate? This is my favourite. But do you really think that that's not going on?
Oh no. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I think that's a good question, and I think
or where is it going on, or where and why is it happening? Because I in my practice in the team, I do see that happening, but I think you're right. There's also anxiety around it, or tensions and difficulties with bringing the political or the social or the identity based into a higher education context. And I think I'm really interested in your sort of thoughts about that, because you've done the work.
No, massively. And I think that the first question was about that kind of overarching question about what inclusive, what EDI is in a higher education context. And I think part of it feeling like a new zeitgeisty thing is that we forget that it's already been going on for a long time, and people are already doing it. They're already thinking about the students in their classes, designing courses, ways of teaching that is student-centered. They might not be thinking about, right, I'm going to design a course so I can, Black students can feel included, but they're building courses that are student-centered, that are kind of universal, inclusive, I suppose. And I think part of that is remembering those histories and affirming what's already happening and making sure we're sharing that, and also, I suppose, giving colleagues the language and the space to identify that they're already doing that. I think sometimes, I've spoken to people and they're like, tell me how to be more inclusive, and you reflect on what they're already doing, and it already is inclusive. There's no more ideas that I can provide to some extent. That's not true. There's always space for that. But I think there's something, isn't there, about that we need to promote that reflective practice. I know that's obviously big for you guys in academic practice. so affirmation, I think, of what's already going on, and then facilitating conversations about what more could be done or how things could be done differently, rather than because I think the risk is saying that's not inclusive, that's kind of a site of exclusion. And I don't think any courses at York and anyone's being fully exclusive. I think there are pockets of brilliant practice, and in fact quite a lot of it actually.
Yeah, and I think that point about definitions and understandings of what is inclusive is really, like, I think there's lots of good work there, and I think a lot of it is fundamentally, and it comes out actually in the article that you shared, Nick, the Matthews one. It's about power, isn't it? It's about how do we address power in a classroom, and you know, how does that feed into your practice? What do you do about it? And that's a sort of bit of students as partners that I find quite interesting, because there's quite a lot of emphasis on equality, and expertise is another thing that's mentioned in the article. And it's interesting you talked about identity too, because I have to admit, there's a bit of me that feels quite uncomfortable about talking about expertise and lived experience. While I know that's valid, I think the university has often, for me, been a space where emotions are dampened down, and actually that's quite helpful for different debates. At the same time, I understand that within those structures there are biases, exclusionary practices, which actually make that problematic. So I suppose, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's something about how we address power dynamics and where that is in people's practice, and how understanding more about inclusivity can help us with that. I hate the word, but journey or you know, process, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that I think sometimes, I suppose, like all literatures, it's kind of the literature around student-staff partnerships and particularly how it's linked to EDI or inclusion. Sometimes, I suppose, romanticizes it a wee bit. That, you know, it needs to make sure it's tackling the challenges as well as espousing the positive outcomes that come from it, because actually it's really messy. I don't think there's always...
So that doesn't come out here, and I'm really glad you're saying that, because I think that's a much more fruitful starting point in terms of getting staff on board, because I am coming at it primarily from a staff perspective. But I think acknowledging that difficulty, and the thing that was sort of interesting here was that talking about it's not a foregone conclusion what comes out of this. I thought that was really productive as a sort of key aspect of partnership, that, you know, if you think you know what the outcome is, it's probably not a very good partnership, or it's not a very sort of fruitful relationship, if you like.
Just for reference here, we've got the paper we're looking at is the 5 propositions for genuine students as partners practice, and we'll put a link to that below the podcast. But what did you see, Nick, as any kind of, are there any metrics we can use to determine what are the causes of some of the things like deficits and things that we're trying to fix, and where we're actually going, what we're trying to achieve, how would we know when we've, you know, improved accessibility and inclusivity within our courses, and you know, how are we measuring gains that we've made?
It's a really good question. Obviously the university institutionally has I suppose quite an ambitious strategy at the minute, target to kind of close all gaps. I think that's an interesting thing, because obviously we've got particular gaps for Black students, for example, that we talk about probably the most, disabled students. But I think the university is starting to talk about it in terms of, I suppose, that universal design, you know, universally inclusive element where we don't want gaps for anyone, which is quite interesting. I think importantly ambitious, but quite difficult to measure and achieve. So I think it's an important question. I think for me it's a broader question, and we've spoken about it before, Lucy, about how we evaluate teaching and the impact of teaching, learning and assessment, and how we're designing courses on students. Is it just that they're getting 2 1s and first? That seems like an important metric that is obviously used by the university, by the sector, and is kind of connected to those, I suppose, regulatory elements like NSS and the Office of Physician stuff. And QA. But I think from my perspective, partnerships and involving students makes us think about a different way of evaluating. You know, if a student gets a 2-1, but they report kind of forms of empowerment or feeling like they belong on a course, or just being happy and confident, presumably that's an important metric as well, but we probably don't talk about that as much as we do their whether they get a 2-1 or whether they've kind of continued, whether they've stayed, because they have to continue and want to stay here in order to get their degree outcome. So I think it's about challenging those kind of, I suppose, the metric-driven way we evaluate student experiences, but also our teaching, learning, assessment. I think, so going back to that from the staff perspective, if a course, for example, there's a gap or students aren't getting 2-1 and first as we want them to, does that necessarily mean there's a fundamental problem with the course? Maybe not. So we kind of need different ways of evaluating that. I would say that involves teacher voice, as well as student voice.
Have we got an idea as to what some of the causes are of so if we take something like the attainment gaps, and we'll hopefully lead this back to students as partners in a minute, but if we go back to the race-based attainment gap, for example, is that something that's linked to broader social issues? For example, we know that there are wealth gaps between ethnic minorities where, accrued wealth over generations means that has impacts on social mobility and things like that, and who can go to university, and we've got university education becoming more expensive. Are these kind of issues, these seems to be like kind of a potentially complex web of causal issues underpinning attainment gaps, for example. Yeah. And if we go in and say, well, we're going to look at academic outputs, is there a chance that we're not addressing things that are, and maybe they're not things that we can fix at university level?
Yeah, I was just going to say, is that the role of a university? Because I think a lot of the role of the university is actually a political role, which has been, and without, again, getting too much into my kind of personal opinions, which has been neglected. I think a lot of the legwork that universities are being asked to do is political work. Now, I don't say that you shouldn't have a political commitment within your practice in learning and teaching, but I don't think universities, and I hear this a lot from staff, can be the only site of change for those things. I know that's not what we're suggesting, but I think there is some quite strong sidelining from the current administration, both in terms of saying, number one, universities are responsible for making this change happen in terms of award gaps. Number two, they're a problem because they're kind of hotbeds of wokery. So, it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, slightly on that. Yeah. Is that where you're coming from, Phil, or have I not? Was that not?
Well, kind of, yeah. I mean, there's a political stance of universities, which I think wasn't the thing that I was thinking more about was if let's say it's the attainment gap is linked to the wealth gap, for example. I'm not sure to the extent that it is, but you might have students who, we want to get more ethnic minorities into higher education, for example, and we might have programs to help that happen. But if there's still things like the wealth gap and social mobility issues haven't been fixed, and I'm not for a minute saying that universities have a responsibility to fix those, but they could partially explain some of the attainment gaps, because it's going to be harder for these students, once they're in universities, to study, because they're going to have to hold down part-time jobs, or they might not have the facilities at home that they want to be able to do the work that they need to get the higher grades. They might just not have the support networks in place. And these are things, as you say, that the universities can't fix. So how important is it to understand these causal roots that are outside of the remit of the university, and before we start looking at, because you might end up with the university having a target of, we want to get equal attainment of two 1s and first-class degrees across ethnic backgrounds, for example. And that just might be a noble but misguided target.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. I think I'll try and remember this author's name that I'm just going to quote, but I think it's really important to, I suppose, frame it in terms of the interplay between those factors. So, an academic out from New Zealand, I think, Ella Kahu, talks about that kind of relationship between cultural factors for students, for example, cultural factors interplaying with the way we design courses and curriculum, and that it's important to understand that whole relationship. And I think you're right. We're not going to address those inequalities just by focusing on how we design assessment, for example, because that's not squarely on, that their experiences of inequality aren't squarely on the classroom and the design of learning teaching. I think what we have to think about, I suppose, as academics and academic developers is making sure that we are addressing it within what we've got, within our gifts, which is to make sure we're designing curriculums that do allow that space for students to feel empowered, but also to some extent reflect their experiences, and reflect the kind of diversity of our student cohort as well as the kind of world outside. But I take your point. I think, going back to Lucy's idea of what the university is, I think we should also be producing, through the way we design courses, but also through the way we kind of contribute to the socialization of students, producing critical citizens, right? That should be the purpose of universities as well. So they do become the next, hopefully not the next, what's the kind of term, wage slaves, but people who do critique the status quo and do go on to work in jobs or within academia or other employment sectors that for want of a better phrase, the university's phrase, kind of contribute to that public good. We've got that as a kind of strategic driver, and I think we need to start embodying that within learning and teaching and assessment. But it for me, that's about producing activist citizens, helping to develop them. It isn't just about kind of partnerships with external commercial enterprises, which I think sometimes it is conflated with with that idea as well.
Yeah, I agree. In short, I think there should be that emphasis on criticality and questioning. I think maybe I'm a bit jaded, but I think I've been in the system for a while, and I think I have questions around when we're part of the structures. How do we lead that change? And I have various levels of comfort with that in my own role, and I think most people working in higher education would have that too. Sure. Whether you're learning and teaching, or whether you're even professional services, you're part of the structure.
Yeah.
You want to be part of the solution to the issues of the structure. That's a fairly tricky balancing act, I think. I was really interested in your point around evaluation and impact of changes that we might make either to curriculum design or to, session design even. And you talked about, and I agree, this notion that, degree outcomes are in a sense a rough measure of learning.
Yeah. And
you said as well, if a student feels empowered, what does that mean? Because I agree, I would like a student to have, the other buzzword is transformational, or kind of, but what does that actually mean? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, good question. I'm going to say, I feel like a bad witness. Yeah.
But because we do want that, don't we?
Yeah.
We do want that.
Yeah, and I think, this is going to sound a little bit wishy-washy, hopefully not, but talking about what we mean by that is important, isn't it?
I agree.
We might not have a single definition of what empowered look like, and maybe that's okay. Maybe we have to ask students and staff what empowered looks like. It might mean different things to different people. I think in my mind, the kind of word and concept and experience of agency comes to mind, and that's why I'm so interested in, and we're so interested in within the inclusive learning team in partnerships, because it has the potential, although messy, it doesn't always work in the way intended. It has that potential to provide or enable students to feel a greater sense of agency, whether that's in a teaching session, or whether that's contributing to the design of a module for future students. Yeah. So feeling part of a decision-making process, or part of a kind of wider community of scholars and students. I think that's what empowering means. Maybe that's my own interpretation.
Yeah, and a lot of that rings true too. I was interested because you brought it up earlier, and it's something I've been thinking about how do we measure or kind of quantify success in terms of learning and teaching, or indeed in terms of wider academic practice. Now, REF and TEF are what institutionally is accepted as that, and they are strongly metrics based, strongly problematic in terms of the kinds of outcomes they're measuring.
Yeah,
we don't even need to get into that, but employment outcomes are not, I would argue, that much to do with the university. You speak to somebody from TFTI, they are to do with the university, but whether your dad's mate can host you in London whilst you're on a placement is a bigger deal than what course you took, because the variation between course outcomes is very, very small. So this is kind of where I'm getting to with, if we work within these institutions, how much is, again, dare I say it, realistic to push for in terms of change? And I think you're spot on with evaluation mechanisms. Yeah. And we talked as well the other day around Athena Swan, which I think is a really useful framework for starting to talk about inclusivity.
Yeah.
And it was set up as an initiative around gender equality, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But I suppose it's getting, and it comes back to frameworks and language, doesn't it, as well? It's shared frameworks and language that come from the sector, which then help us self-assess how well we're doing. Because I think the point about metrics is they're rough tools. Actually, I'm more interested, as you sort of were pointing out, to more qualitative stuff. So whether that's student responses or accounts of learning experiences or staff kind of giving case studies of what they think is good inclusive practice, and that being part of a submission, for example, for Athena Swan.
Yeah.
I think that's got some genuine traction.
Yeah.
So I suppose I'm just interested in those sort of, meso-level institutional stuff. And
Yeah. I'm with you. I think it's difficult, isn't it? I suppose you said you were jaded earlier. I think it's come.
We might edit that.
No.
Let's just see how that goes.
But I think it's important, isn't it? Maybe because I'm quite new to it. You kind of feel like there's micro moments and ways we can resist even within a certain. I'm not saying I love the university in many ways. We're a neoliberal institution because we're part of a sector that is, and part of a kind of political climate that is. But I think there's ways to resist that, and maybe one way that from our perspective is through thinking about different ways to measure quality in terms of teaching and students and staff's experiences as well. Challenging the way we do SoTL, for example, and challenging that kind of metric drivenness of the way we think about quality courses.
Say more about challenging SoTL as the years prick up.
No, just reading the paper. I think I've forgotten the title of it. Reading the paper that you guys
the knowledge mobilization strategies.
That's right. Because I thought
again a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah, but I thought that was really interesting about. And it's to me, this word deliberate comes up a lot from me in my practice and our team as well. Just thinking deliberately about how students can be involved within
I have to say,
SoTL.
That is what academics do. They are deliberate thinkers. So this is where I have a bit of an issue, because I don't think there are people not thinking deliberately. I think that's exactly what they're doing. So I think, why am I so antithetical? I feel a bit up, but I think it's because there's an implication that people aren't doing it, and they are doing it. Yeah. But I don't know, why is it not coming through more?
Yeah. No, completely. And we're on the same page, I think. Maybe just
I'm just on
different levels of jadedness. Yeah. But I think it comes back to when we were talking about earlier about naming it as inclusive practice. Yes. People are already doing it, and you're right. We need to be the types of people within our roles that say you're already doing it. Yeah. Not coming from that deficit model of you're doing SoTL wrong because you're not involving students.
Yeah.
It's okay not to have involved students in the past. That's fine. It's an emerging area, isn't it?
There'll be lots of times when it's okay not to now.
No, exactly.
But what's interesting is that it's you're right. It's got a profile now, maybe in a way that it didn't before. And I think there are moments that have political and kind of institutional weight behind them. And you're right. I would see it as the role of people in developmental roles to support that and kind of get it moving more. So, I think, scholarship, if the point here is that if it's done well, it should be taking into account student perspectives, isn't it? Yeah. It should be this democratic, shared teaching commons kind of thing. What did people think of what I read as the sort of main argument here around the sharing and the translating is underdeveloped versus the involving students as, co-creators of SoTL projects. Do you do that in your practice, Phil? Do you talk to students do you say, I've designed this lesson this way because the literature says it's good? Or do they talk about conversational scholarship, which I found really interesting?
Actually have done in the past, but I think it's, this is one of the things I've wondered before about how many teachers, lecturers actually talk to students about why they're doing things the way they are doing them. And that might speak to experts in their field who for them, the knowledge of their field is the primary concern, and it's less about the learning and teaching process, and whether that's, connected to carrying out their own scholarship or doing scholarly informed teaching. I often wonder why there's not more bandwidth of each module that students take, for example, where given over to how to learn the material that we are telling you. And instead, I'm just going to stand here and tell you about stuff. I'm going to talk to you about the Reformation for 2 hours, and what you take of it is up to you.
So they do that now in schools, not just the Reformation bit. My son has just gone into secondary, and he had a pre-induction pack, which was all about growth mindset and all about learning to learn. He would not go near it. So I read it and went, this is great. This is really useful and that's a kid from 2 academic parents in a very supported household. So again, I am literally come across as really jaded, and I'm not. But I think there's a connection with your point around articulating what we're doing. And my view and my experience is that academics are extremely good at making deliberated decisions, sometimes less good at articulating the rationale for that with students.
Yeah.
So I think you bang on with that. How many of us actually in our kind of standard practice go, I did this because of this.
Yeah.
I'm seeing it happen more and more, but I don't think that's standard practice. And that would be such an economical way of kind of opening up and kind of removing that fourth wall between students and teachers.
Yeah. And just to loop it back to inclusion, that I think, and it goes back to that definition of, I think sometimes we conflate inclusion with accessibility. So, and usually then academics, people designing courses then think about it solely in terms of assessment. But a simple thing about sometimes, I'm
We're both going to start
I just saw Lucy at the kind of, no, I'm joking. Where was I going with that? So I think that thinking about how that deliberate communication about, choices that you make within, whether that's a teaching approach or why you going over a certain, bit of the curriculum in a certain week and in the way you're doing it, why are you making me work in a group, for example, that does have an inclusive element because I think it's probably within, research has proven that for certain groups of students, that is going to be really helpful to have that rammed down your throat in a way and to make them connect the teaching approach with what they're learning or how they're being assessed has the potential to contribute to, I suppose, more effective learning. And I think assessment is a really good example of it. And again, my own positionality is I'm not a teacher. I've not come from that kind of academic or teacher background. But I think to me, it seems like assessment is one of those spaces where we don't deliberately enough talk about why we choose the assessments we do, and how it contributes to learning. I think it's changing, with learning outcomes and all that kind of stuff. But I think we almost need to let students in behind the kind of stage door of assessment and not be such a kind of, I don't think it's intentionally secretive, but I think that's how it feels to students and maybe staff as well.
That's interesting. So one reason why they might not do that is they might not be aware that it's useful. What might be the other reasons for not including that learning about learning or being explicit about assessment?
I think probably it's just time pressures. And I think if you're teaching a course and you have a set amount of material to deliver and you know that it's important not just to get through it, but for students to feel that they've been exposed to it in a meaningful way and they feel prepared for, whatever's to come in terms of assessment or whatever's next. I mean, that's the preoccupation. And it's like when any of us start the day, you have a certain amount of things to do and you know that some of them are important, but they are crowded out by the immediate concerns of the detritus of the day. But you just have not that, module diets are full of detritus. I mean, you have to get through some really interesting and valid stuff, but it subsumes everything. And it's hard to carve a space out, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think, I suppose that's how it interplays. The kind of relationship between, I suppose, policy and strategy and students and staff, isn't it? That space needs to be found from somewhere and facilitated, probably through institutional measures rather than, and that's the problem, isn't it? Rather than people going above and beyond or just adding to their to-do
It
list.
relies on that
Yeah.
at the minute. But that's why I was really taken by the conversational, because actually that's realistic. Again, she says, which is such a, God, I'm so not used to playing this kind of dream crushing role. It's just, I'm really feeling uncomfortable. But I suppose you could, and some departments do introduce, an embedded skills course around how do you approach an academic essay, what are the expectations here. You could have a starting session where you say, this is what I think a seminar is. Do you think it's that? Shall we reach some kind of shared agreement on what it might be usefully? But you can really easily slip into a session. The reason I chose this task is this. It worked last year really well, and this was the feedback I got.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this. I'd really welcome your feedback on it after the session. And it's that, for me, I suppose, coming from the practitioner kind of angle, those things feel, it's like you said, micro moments of resistance to a model. And actually they're useful for students, and they're quite uplifting as a pedagogue as well, because you feel that you can actually make a little difference. So I think there are bits we can do around it, but I think there's also constraints around bigger changes, but then lots of small change hopefully leads you in that direction.
Yeah.
Can I just come back to one thing about bringing it back again to scholarship, which is that if we want to have meaningful sort of, again, I will use the word data, but meaningful information about how students experience learning or what they got from their degree. One thing that strikes me is there seems to be a paucity of longitudinal studies in SoTL. And there's a reason for that, is that they're not funded. So there's also sort of research methods issues that stop us getting that kind of data. So if you want to do a really good longitudinal study, you've got to really kind of show people why it's important to turn up in 5 years' time. And I think if the information I would really value from students is 5 years after they've graduated.
Yeah.
What do you think now you got and didn't get? What was helpful, what wasn't so helpful? So I just wonder if, again, there'd be any kind of scholarship we could do about, I don't know, taking the measure of the temperature of student perceptions at various points during a degree. And then I'm guessing there'd be lots of ethical issues there too about who you approach and how, but it's somehow getting at that more qualitative and more longitudinal information that I think I notice is not altogether there in the scholarship that I've seen.
No, I think you bang on with saying it's about funding, isn't it? Because if we work in a university way on a kind of year by year, for example, I've led on the Learning and Teaching Fund distribution and facilitation this year, which is kind of new, or a new, I suppose, bringing together of old funds post-COVID, and we kind of very much have worked on a yearly basis. It probably squeezed into 6 months now, actually, because they got given their funding in January, February, and will have to have spent it to some extent. Well, no, not to some extent. They will before the end of July, with the end of the financial year. That was a bit of a boring thing, but I think it's relevant. It is relevant.
We were looking for scholarship on inclusivity as well.
Yeah, so exactly. So I think it's kind of a plea, isn't it, to think we have to kind of have a funding model, within or a process that allows for that longer piece of work. I think other universities, from what I've seen, are able to do that. This isn't a criticism of our financial, the way we do our accounting at the university, but I think, if we could facilitate that, that'd be brilliant, because I think it goes back to why we do that, I think. And, if we see education as a process, why don't we want to look at and explore with students their experience along that journey? Because it shifts at the minute. If we do, we do modular evaluation, NSS, or kind of small short-term sort of projects. In a way, we're doing snapshots, aren't we? So that kind of narrative approach where we're looking at how their experiences change, maybe that will shed light on those award gaps we talked about earlier. What are those points, or what went wrong for certain students at different points, and what were the pinch points, whether it's related to assessment or just general life, I suppose, life load. But I think that'd kind of deepen our understanding, definitely.
It is done in the States in small Catholic liberal arts colleges. So
which we are not. Yeah.
Which I think it's safe to say we are not. But it's interesting that you can do it if you know. So their evaluations are they talk to students 3-4 years after graduation and make connections between the program of study they did and how much kind of civic participation they're undertaking. So it's really interesting. There would be different ways of doing it, but they're seen as a bit out there and crazy.
Okay.
But there's research and scholarship on that. You know.
Yeah. Just a quick question about with the students as partnerships idea. So it's about having these conversations with students and involving them in pedagogical decisions and sort of how we deliver and design courses.
Yeah.
How frequently do you think? Because you often encounter these kinds of responses from students that of what they would like or what they see. Because as Lucy says, we do have these conversations and they do happen. But I often find myself torn because you have to have this conversation where they've suggested something that is not a good idea. There's whether it's research that information from cognitive psychology or how we learn or just feasibility of delivery. So is there a danger sometimes where you're sort of like, hey guys, come on, like contribute your ideas, let's hear them, and then you shoot them down one by one? Is that a valid concern?
I think it's a really good question. I think this way of doing things isn't popular is not the right word, but it isn't embedded either at York or across the UK higher education sector. It's still quite, I think, it's increasing in popularity or usage, but I think it's still a kind of, like you said, out there. Yeah. It feels new. It feels like an uncomfortable way of doing it. It feels like a radical, nice to have, I think. From what I've read and experienced personally, I suppose the positive thing about forming a partnership at the core of that is relationships or changing relationships between students and staff. So it'd be more than okay to say no to some things. But again, going back to that point about being deliberate, because you're maybe entering into a kind of space where students have more agency. It's not just them providing you feedback and you shooting them down. You can have a discussion. It's a kind of dialogue about it, isn't it? And you can get across why that isn't feasible. They might be able to come back at you as well. I think that's kind of part of the dialogue. It still might not be feasible. That doesn't make it feasible. But I think setting partnerships and kind of ways of doing that co-creation up as it's not about students getting everything they might want or need. It's having increasingly honest and open conversations about what's possible and what I suppose can contribute to students learning in a better way. Because I think in my mind, and it's a really simple idea, I know we've covered quite a lot of complex ground, but bringing students and staff together to talk about this stuff feels like the right thing to do. Not just the right thing to do though. I think in a subtle context. And it doesn't always have to be that kind of full co-creation. I think it's on a continuum, isn't it? And it's all important. Students might learn, or might know a bit more about their learning than we do sometimes. So I think having that at the center of our minds, that doesn't mean that we're kind of stripping colleagues of their expertise necessarily. It means that we're kind of bringing what students know about their experiences, about their learning, into dialogue with what staff know about feasibility, about teaching methods, about pedagogy, and I think that's the potential of these types of ways of working.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a couple of other little questions about just listening to while you were talking. Is there so I might jump around a little bit with these, but hopefully there's a thread. But is there a tension sometimes between this idea of inclusivity in terms of what you want to study, for example? If you want to make sure. We want to make areas of knowledge inclusive, and we want to make sure that people, the humanities, for example, are as viable in terms of their delivery as, lucrative subjects like STEM and business. Is there a tension between that and this constant, the background hum of employability that we hear all the time? So the degrees need to pay for themselves. We're very conscious that there is an investment and, because they're so expensive, people want to get their money back, and they want to make so employability is understandably this huge thing that everyone's thinking about. But is that a tension? Is that does that mean that some of these degrees that are valuable for lifelong learning, like the humanities and the more philosophical subjects, get sort of swept aside somehow? How is there a way of balancing these and bringing them in without them getting drowned out by employability?
Yeah, good question. I think I was at a World Cafe style event the other day with colleagues from social policy. I can't remember what's the school called now.
SBS.
Yeah, SBS. Yeah, of which obviously social policy is part. And similar questions were coming up about how do we square that tension between employability. So thinking in particular about assessment types and choices. How do we square that, providing those so-called real world, authentic assessment types with inclusion, which I thought was an interesting one. That got me thinking about, in those degrees and those areas you're talking about, is one way of kind of thinking about that, providing making students, giving them the opportunities to do different types of, I suppose, knowledge expression assessments that isn't just an essay, potentially. Is that a way of kind of addressing some of the tensions you're talking about? But then the inclusive tension comes with, well, I don't want to be grilled as in a role play situation, because that's kind of triggering to me, or that's making me particularly anxious. So I think it's the tension between the types of courses, the kind of omnipotent discourse of employability, which I think you're right. If that's what I'm kind of understanding your question to be, I think we should challenge that. But then squaring that with questions about accessibility and students' anxieties as well is an interesting one. And again, going back to, there's no easy answer to that. Lucy, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on
No,
on
I'm
that.
really pleased that you took that on, Nick. Yeah, it's enormous, isn't it? I mean, there were 2 or 3 things in there about who chooses which degrees, maybe, for what reasons, what does that do to the discipline itself. So I do think it comes back to the kind of classroom level of how do you, maybe in a humanities seminar, bring in lived experience, but do that in a safe way. There's lots of PG CAP projects we've looked at around trigger warnings. And actually, that was, again, I'm going a bit off on a tangent, but the pedagogical conclusion from that is that actually trigger warnings are not massively helpful in avoiding trauma. They're very helpful in signalling to the wider class that this is a sensitive subject and that does something to the learning environment.
Yeah.
So, there's interesting ways about how do we address that. I'm not sure that was in any way.
Just chipping back, I think we can make those types of courses link up to employability, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Through assessment choices. But I think we should also be critical about not just, not conflating innovative assessment, authentic experiences for students and the real world, because what real world are we preparing them for?
Right, which takes you back to your criticality stuff, doesn't it? And civic participation.
We shouldn't just be preparing them for a career with PwC. Not that that's a problem.
Nothing wrong with that.
No, exactly. Yeah. No. Just to
Sponsoring this episode.
Yeah, all the PwC interns out there. No. But it's just about diversity, isn't it? We should be preparing students for different sectors.
All right. So here's a question then. If we thinking about all the things that we've covered, talking about like the cost of all these issues, the cost of university degrees, attainment gaps, diversity issues, and everything else. Oh, and the other thing I think worth commenting here is metrics, whether they're good or bad. And we heard about a lot in the literature about how they're not fit for purpose or they're misleading and things like that. What would a higher education system look like?
Oh, good. We can be positive.
What would it look like if we were starting from scratch and we didn't have a lot of legacy baggage? We could design a system that was people could study and learn in ways that we know is effective and we know contributes to society. All these naive and idealistic sounding things that we. What would it look like? Would it be free? Would it be like Scandinavia?
Do you want to go first?
don't all jump at once. I think fees does make a massive difference. I do think that's fundamental. Not that I think university was a place without issues prior to that, but I think framing all the stuff we've talked about today, I think part of the kind of jadedness or the sort of worry around things is about fundamentally how can we prioritise learning and inclusivity and democratic education in a system where we frame students as consumers. I just think that's what we're dealing with. And I think there are things we can do, but that, for me, that's probably a real sticking point. Again, I've been in Nordic education systems and it is different. It's qualitatively different if you don't pay. My partner did a PhD that he never would have been able to do in the UK. Came from a single parent working class family, first in families university, was at university for 12 years, which even by Finnish standards was quite a long time. He enjoyed it. But I think what that does to your sense of your identity as a student is something we should actually talk about a lot. And the kinds of conversations you're describing wanting to happen, I think, are a way of resisting that.
Yeah.
So I'd see that as a long way of saying free.
Yeah, I definitely concur with that. I think yeah, you're right. These, we talked about partnership and co-creation. It feels like one of the reasons that those types of approaches I think are marginal is that they do problematize a kind of neoliberal consumer model, don't they? They don't see education as a democratic process. They see it as something. What's the kind of best analogy? Maybe kind of pizza delivery in a way, and you see that with student and staff, and colleagues' identities, don't you, as well? That they embody and enact that kind of delivery recipient model. So I think my utopian higher education would be where we challenge that, and that everyone had the space to work together in some way, but definitely see it as a kind of collective process, reciprocal and a kind of mutually empowering process, rather than something that we buy in.
That's the word. Utopia was what I was looking for. Yeah, maybe it wouldn't have to be that. It's just this. It's just solving some of the tension. This idea of how do we use? Because obviously you need to measure stuff. You need to use metrics and data. Yeah, you need accountability and make sure stuff's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But at the same time, we've seen examples of how it just doesn't. Reduces ideas down to the numbers themselves become a bit meaningless because they're just being gamed.
Yeah.
Do people feel like there's more space around that as an idea? This, because I think for all my kind of old jadedness, I do feel that the situation now is different to maybe 10 years ago, in that we do at least pay lip service to things more like academic community, student partnership, inclusive diversity. And I think they do open up spaces. But again, from a self-critique, I'm always wondering, is that just because I'm in full-time employment now, where 10 years ago I was on temporary contracts?
Yeah.
So I feel like maybe there's been a bit of resistance and push the other way, but I also get, lots of sort of, I'm aware of a lot of people who would strongly question that and say, it's not enough.
Yeah. I think it's about making sure that these concepts and ways of working aren't hollowed out, right? And partnership, for example, we see it in kind of university, not our strategy necessarily, but in university strategies across the sector, we do partnership, and you kind of look into that and it's like, do you really? I'm not, it's conceived differently, and it's more of a kind of tick box, having course reps, really important, brilliant, doesn't constitute a kind of strategic approach to embedding partnership within learning and teaching.
Yeah.
And I suppose the same with inclusive practice as well. If we're kind of wholly inclusive, what does that mean? We need to be careful not to hollow it out and just conflate, everything, EDI, and just accessibility, thinking about it really holistically and kind of critically. But that's difficult within the current climate. But we're, making podcasts about it is a good step
at a time.
Exactly.
And what about you, Phil?
Yeah.
Before you're getting away with that, what would your educational utopia be?
Oh, I don't really have one.
Okay.
I'm just
just fishing for ideas.
I'm just here to ask the questions. No, I don't know. I mean, it would be I I genuinely have no idea. I mean, I think it's stuff's going to be paid for, but it can't be prohibitively expensive. We want to get incentive structures lined up so that it's not all about assessment, and we're encouraging the right kind of learning, not just setting up as, universities as rubber stampers of qualifications. There needs to be, I think the idea of lifelong learning needs to become a little bit more pronounced. And I don't know what the answers are. Maybe it's, I think it's going to be linked somehow to, like we were talking about earlier, like just broader social policies and social mobility. I think just perhaps the idea of getting rid of poverty. Yeah, that's how I do it. Yeah. Or mitigating poverty, wealth gaps in society generally. And I think as when you start to solve these broader social issues, it's going to have knock-on effects into the institutions. But I think it's. I mean, my question earlier was really based around the idea of you're seeing a lot of subjects closed down in universities because they're not viable financially, which is a huge shame because there's so much that can come out of some of these degrees and educations and subjects that you don't immediately appreciate. And it's like,
and isn't that the point of a university as well? Yeah. The university, for me, part of it is it's a community of practice that's not just one faculty or one discipline. Like I would argue that the practice of somebody in physics is maybe not tangentially, maybe not sort of super explicitly, but it's enhanced by being in a wider intellectual community. Because actually you might meet someone over coffee who talks to you about a more inclusive form of practice that they used in their lunchtime lecture series that you would never encounter within your own department or discipline. So there's something about having those things together. I mean, the clue's in the word, isn't it? It's universal, university. It's something that brings together those different ways of thinking and approaching. I think that's valuable. So I agree. I think it's problematic if we only incentivise the stuff that leads to this very narrow lane of so-called employability.
And I mean, I don't know too much about liberal arts or that kind of way of doing it in the States, but I think it seems like there's so much value in that. I don't know, maybe we'll have that at York sometime soon.
Yeah.
And I think to me, we talk a lot about decolonising in our team, and it's kind of sparked me when you were talking then, because we often think about STEM and people say, how can we decolonise that? And part of that thinking is physicists shouldn't just be based in their lab. Obviously they are, but are we producing physicists who aren't going to think critically about the social world as well as the material world and the relationship between the material world and the social world? So whether that's, how do we combat that? Is that decolonising specific disciplines, or is it also facilitating interdisciplinarity, which I know the university is keen on, whether mods and SEMS enables that. Hopefully it will. But I think moving towards more interdisciplinary opportunities for students, I think is really important. Hopefully that would mean we wouldn't get rid of sociology. It feels like we've gone back to Thatcher in a way, doesn't it? Where those types of courses aren't financially viable or aren't important in some way. It depends on the government as well, doesn't it? What the priorities are in terms of higher education. It's kind of very much, I suppose, industry, STEM focused at the minute, isn't it? Research and development stuff. So it'd be interesting if and when we have a different change of government.
I know we're close to time, but I feel like we've put ourselves through the ringer on stuff. Just on that, I think the employability stuff, again, it's often about asking questions. When we say employability, do we mean students are in work 6 months after a degree, as more or less TEF suggests? Or do we say it's about the quality of job? Or do we ask the students, well, what kind of job you want? And I don't think students are only, I don't think anybody in here suggests so, but I think there's often a sort of caricature of students and learners as people who just want to be employed. Well, actually, if that was your motivation, you wouldn't be at a university, because you could just be employed in a fairly well-paying job without going to university. It's something about decision-making and how many decisions you get to make in your work and how autonomous you get to be in your work. Yeah. And I think within, humanities or non-sort of vocational degrees, we need to, again, get better at self-articulating what's the value in terms of how will this help you make decisions? How will it make you critically engage with what's happening around you? How would it make you more able to facilitate new relationships? Because I think that's there. I think that value is there. I don't think we need to kind of change those degrees to make them more like science degrees.
Yeah.
I think we need to get better at articulating what it is that they bring learners in their current form. And when you see that done, it's great. You know, it does happen sometimes. Just a bit more space for it.
Yeah, no, I completely. And building on, you know, conversations we've had about assessment, more opportunities for students to reinforce those skills that they're learning throughout those types of degrees. You know, whether that's kind of the capacity to reflect, and you know, why don't we talk about emotions and relationships within those courses? That's what students do. It's what staff do in an educational process. That's really important. Unless you want to be self-employed on a Scottish island or something as a farmer, which is fine. But you're going to have
a degree for that.
Yeah. There is an apprenticeship coming to York on Scottish island farming.
Missing
It's
a rising market.
But yeah, you know, relationships and all those so-called soft skills. I hate that concept because we completely, you know, we kind of completely devalue it when we call it soft, I think, to some extent. So yeah.
Well, we've dragged you all over the EDI landscape. But yeah, you've been brilliant with your. Thank you for being so adaptable with that. Is there anything else that you? And there's tons of stuff we haven't covered. We only briefly mentioned decolonizing and things like that. These are probably huge conversations in their own right. I mean, is there anything just immediately within your remit that you wanted to cover before we time out?
I don't think so. I suppose just a plea with. I mean, we've talked around the houses, haven't we? I suppose sometimes it's valuable for colleagues, for staff, just to bring it back together. I think it's all connected is what I'm kind of trying to say, whether that's kind of decolonizing, partnership, creating agency, the way we design assessment. I think this is kind of bookending it, but student-centeredness feels like an important concept within all that, that might, you know, be here longer than the kind of sexy concepts of decolonizing and inclusive practice. Not that they should go anywhere, but I think if we're thinking about student learning, we can't go too far wrong. And I think that's what we're doing from an inclusive perspective and what you're doing from an AP perspective as well.
Agree more.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Nick. That's been really great. Is there anywhere people can go to find more about EDI or specifically what you're doing at York?
Yes, we do have a website. Yeah. We do have a website and a toolkit. I'm just trying to find out what is the.
I think unlike our team, if you Google it, it comes up, Nick. So
yeah, it is.
It's not bad.
Yeah. So if you Google inclusive learning at York, then you should find our toolkit. And the email addresses. I'm more than happy to have conversations with colleagues as well.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll link to important bits below. Thank you very much. Peace out.
Thank you.